You know, a business structure or arrangement that brings together two or more separate businesses or entities that share capital, risks, and profit in a joint business. Right? What is important here is that very often the capital is not in cash, or the capital of one partner may not be in cash, but may be in-kind contribution. It may be technology, it may be premises, it may be plant and facilities, etc. Right? But you always have to be very careful here in terms of assessing the value of in-kind contributions to a joint venture. So before you enter into the joint venture, make sure you have a clear idea as to how you're going to assess any in-kind contribution that is brought into the joint venture by another partner. Always be careful of that, right? Because business people generally tend to seek the best deal for themselves. So you have to be very, very careful, right? I recall when the government of Trinidad and Tobago had purchased an oil company. My father, who was a gauger for over 30-something years in the oil industry, took me down to the oil wells. He had a detailed knowledge of the history of the oil wells. And he was able to point out to me which wells were reactivated for the purpose of the sale. And he was able to explain why those wells were capped. Now, I'm not saying that the government of Trinidad and Tobago was not aware that wells were activated or reactivated. But you have to be very careful, because you may be buying something that looks good, right? And it may not be what it tries to show, right? So always get details on the history of the assets that you're buying. I recall once in London, I worked for an organization there, and we leased photocopiers from a leasing company. We had a very sophisticated photocopier. The lease was for 3 years. At the end of the 3 years, we leased a more modern brand of photocopier. And the guy who came to take the photocopier, I asked him, I said, so what are you going to do with this photocopier now? He said that they were going to recondition it. And he said, when we recondition this photocopier, it looks brand new. He did not say that he's going to sell it and he was going to sell it to a third world country. That is, they would normally sell it to third world countries. Now, I'm not saying that they are selling it as new photocopiers, but the fact that it looks new when it's reconditioned should put persons on guard, right, whenever you're buying something. So whenever a joint venture partner is bringing in-kind contribution to the business, do your due diligence, right? Have in place professionals to do an assessment of the in-kind contribution that is brought, the assets that is brought, so that you would not you would not lose out in the deal. Another part of the in-kind contribution could be goodwill. You see goodwill mentioned there. No, it's not mentioned. Right? The estimation of goodwill is a very technical thing, right? Do not leave it to yourself to assess what someone's goodwill is. Try to get expert advice as to how goodwill, a person's goodwill is assessed. Why joint venture? I think an important reason for joint ventures is that the synergies created by joining forces will bring a greater impact, capacity, and efficiency than if the parties operated on their own. Right? So efficiency is normally the driving force, and of course profits. Now, what's the rationale for joint ventures? First rationale is access to capital, technology, and finance. A company may not have sufficient capital or access to capital from the traditional sources, the banks, financial institutions, etc., to go into another phase of their business or to go into a foreign market, right? So one of the reasons for getting into joint ventures would be to access capital of the other partner. Another reason would be access to markets and distribution channels. You may be operating in Trinidad, you want to get into perhaps Suriname, you're not familiar with the situation there, so you may need a joint venture in order to access that foreign market. Business expansion, you may need to expand your business, go beyond what it is right now, and you may not have sufficient cash or know how to expand your business, so you would seek a joint venture. And in all cases, joint ventures lead to a greater capacity of the business and access to international markets. Another reason for getting into joint ventures is to develop new products. The technology changes very quickly, and there might be some obsolescence in your product or your manufacturing process, and you need to get into new products, so you may want to get into joint ventures. Another reason is access to increased technical expertise. You may not have the expertise within your company, and you need additional expertise, so you can seek joint venture. And another very important reason, particularly in the energy sector, is sharing of risks and costs. Some of the energy projects are very risky and capital intensive, high capital intensive. So you may need to share that responsibility with a joint venture rather than going it alone. And another reason could be a strategic move against competition. You may need to join forces to deal with a common competitor in the market. In the line of work that we do, consultancy, very often we enter into not merely we have 1 or 2 joint ventures, but collaboration agreements with other consultants in order to deal with the competition for consultancies in the region here by foreign consulting firms, particularly where projects are funded by international agencies or agencies that are based abroad, European Union, etc. And just to go back to that slide, sometimes too, and I know it exists in the energy sector, sometimes tenders are bundled, the services are bundled, and you may only be able to provide one part of the total package of services that are required by a tender. You may not be able to provide all the services in that particular tender, so you may want to join forces with another company that could provide those services that you cannot provide. And I know that happens in the energy sector. This is one of the complaints, that the tenders tend to be bundled and not unbundled. It happens in technology, telecommunications industry also. What are the essentials of a joint venture? First of all, there must be a shared business objective as defined in a strategic business plan. Now, a survey was done among CEOs to find out what are the 5 top factors that lead to success of joint ventures, and one of them was shared business objective. You must have a clear business objective while you're getting into this joint venture. There must, of course, be shared ownership and shared contribution to the authorized capital. There must be shared governance and control over management. And when you are negotiating your joint venture agreements, etc., there may be certain issues, management decisions to be taken, that you may need to say that both parties must agree to these management decisions. For example, raising additional capital, hiring or dismissing key staff, seeking loans, selling company assets, etc. Right? You may want to ensure that both parties give their consent to that. Otherwise, if both parties do not give their consent to that, you know what can happen. And another essential element is shared profits or losses. Both parties, they share the profits and they share their losses. Now, forms of joint venture. One is considered to be full integration. It resembles a merger. The parties produce similar goods or provide similar services, and they seek to integrate their functions in one area of business or all of their business. Right? So, for example, you may seek to integrate only a distribution network with a joint venture, or all of the things like distribution, production, etc., human resource, etc. And this is particularly useful for small businesses where a primary objective would be to enhance capacity to meet the demands of the market. You may want to integrate with another company. Now, in the joint venture, remember that you may maintain your own corporate identity separate and apart from the joint venture. Or you may want to integrate fully, which is a merger, which is considered to be a kind of joint venture. Then you have research and development, with which Larry and myself are quite familiar, where parties pool skills, knowledge, or equipment to develop better products, services, or production methods. And it may be for a limited purpose, right? Quite a lot of joint ventures are not for an indefinite period, but for a finite period, for a limited period and duration. Limited purpose and duration, it might be to do a specific tender. A project resulting from a specific tender. And after that, the joint venture is dissolved. Then you have production and marketing, another form of joint venture. Parties either produce goods or services together, or where they produce it, they don't produce it together, they market it together. Purchasing, another form of joint venture, purchasing, where the parties agree to purchase goods together. You get greater efficiency where you purchase goods together. And I know within CARICOM, we had a project years ago where all the Caribbean countries would seek to procure pharmaceuticals on a joint basis. But like most CARICOM projects, you know what happened, that just fell by the wayside. And then there could be indirect forms of joint venturing, like networking. And that is common in the telecommunications industry, banking, travel. Right? For example, think about the link system, which is used by a number of banks. In the airline industry, you have code sharing agreements and companies providing joint services in terms of reservation, ground services, etc. And then there are management contracts, which is sort of indirect form of joint venture, where the facility is owned by one party, but it is managed by one of the established hotel chains. For example, the Hyatt in Trinidad and the Hilton, they are owned by the government of Trinidad and Tobago. But there's this management contract now with Hyatt and with Hilton to manage the facilities on behalf of the government. And then there are licensing arrangements, another indirect form of joint venture, where you grant a franchise perhaps, with strong control by the franchisor. Very often all of the inputs must be purchased from the franchisor, as well as the brand. You use the franchisor's brand as well. And then there's contract manufacturing, which takes place a lot in the textile industry. You may be in the textile industry in Trinidad and Tobago, and you get a large order as a result of a mission by TT Export. You may not have the capacity to produce the quantities that are required. And very often, you enter into agreements with a party in a different country, maybe in Latin America, Central America, India, or China, to manufacture your designs on your behalf. Finding a strategic partner. You know, a survey was done among CEOs in America to find out what are the 5 top reasons for success of joint ventures. And the top reason was the selection of the right partner. Right? The second reason was the senior management team that you're able to assemble together and the commitment of that senior management team to the joint venture. The third was clearly understood roles of the different parties. You know, sometimes you have a joint venture and the roles are a little bit fuzzy. Clearly understood roles. The fourth was effective communication between the partners. And the fifth was clearly defined objectives of the joint venture. These were considered to be the 5 top reasons for success of joint ventures. Before you enter into a joint venture, you should really try to develop a business strategy and a business plan. I know some consultants are not too much in favor of business plans because they say they're generally not effective. They prefer strategic frameworks within which to operate. Right? So try and have a clear idea as to what your business plan is, even before seeking a partner. Right? You try and clarify what your objectives, first of all, would be, and what the contribution of the partner will be. Whether you want him to put cash, whether you want technology, whether you want expertise, whether you want his markets, whether you want his brand, etc. And clarify the duration. That's always very important. Even where the joint venture is not for a limited period or a specified period, always ensure when you're negotiating the agreement that you have an exit strategy. I recall I negotiated a joint venture for a company that I worked with. And there was a provision on exit strategy. And my CEO called me and he said, you know, the agreement is good, but why you have an exit strategy does that not signal a lack of faith in the venture? And I explained to him, I said, no, that is common in joint venture agreements. And once you have that exit strategy there, if the joint venture does not work out, it's easier for the parties to deal with the dissolution of the joint venture. And in fact, that joint venture did not last. After 2 years, the organization was dissolved. The joint venture was dissolved. But fortunately, we had in the agreement all the provisions that would be applied in the event where the joint venture is dissolved. Assess your risks, and we'll go into a lot more detail with respect to the risks, all the risks that would be involved. Right? It's very, very complicated in terms of the different risks that would be involved. From partnering with the wrong person, somebody who might be a politically exposed person in terms of the United States, or otherwise. You know, once we were having a World Beat Music Festival, and we were negotiating agreements with artists, and we wanted to get this Cuban music group, I think it's Los Van Van?
Los Van Van.
Los Van Van, yes. And we signed the agreement and everything. And when we were about to pay the 50% down deposit, the bank told us, no way. They cannot pay the 50% down payment to a Cuban company because their agents, corresponding agents for all international payments are US banks. And the US under their Foreign Economic Relations Act has imposed sanctions on all payments going to Cuba. And we'll get into that a little more detail, in a little more detail when we go on to deal with the legal aspects of I see you smile, Denise. Yeah. Could be very, very tricky. Could be very, very tricky. We have lots of cases where in international business transactions where you deal with an international person. And this is why important when you do it, and we'll get to that in another slide, when you're doing the assessment of the partner, you have to know everything about that partner, what subsidiaries they have, what businesses they have, etc. Because the long reach of the US arm could affect your situation, right? US imposed extra jurisdictional sanctions against a lot of organizations for many different reasons. It could be because of expropriation of US authority. It could be like in the case of Iran, political differences, Ukraine right now, etc. And if you're dealing with somebody who has some connection, right, in these particular countries, even though your transaction with the person, right, does not relate to those countries, you may be affected. You may be affected. But we'll get into a little more detail about that later on. Always seek assistance of your investment promotion agency or your investment advisor in identifying suitable partners. And the Chamber of Commerce as well, in identifying suitable partners. Understand the culture and management style of your prospective partners. I know of one particular project in a Central American country. My daughter was involved in that. Went over there to do a project, a joint venture with an organization over there. And before the project even started, right, because of the cultural differences or the failure on the part of the directorate of the organization to understand that culture, the project was not given approval. So it's very, very important to understand the culture and management style of your prospective partner. And of course, you do your MOU with your prospective partner even before you enter into the joint venture agreement. And we'll get into a little more detail about that later on. Process. What process you should observe in entering into joint ventures, right? And this is not an exhaustive list. Bear in mind, this is not an exhaustive list, right? People always advise that you do your SWOT analysis of your own company before you even approach a joint venture. And that will help you to define what you're looking for, because the best joint ventures are those where the parties complement each other. You have something that they don't have, and they have something that you don't have that could work towards a joint venture, right? Your clarification of your strategic objectives. What are your strategic objectives in getting into this joint venture? And what are your partners, prospective partners' strategic objectives as well? Because remember, you're dealing with two parties here, not only your own self. So try to understand what is your prospective partner's strategic objectives in getting into a joint venture with you. Right? It might be money laundering. It might be. It might be, might very well be. But he would not tell you that. It's only when you do your due diligence and all your checks, then you may be able to realize that, hey, this fellow real objective is money laundering, you know. Right? You have to ensure that you disclose relevant information to the person and get relevant information from the other party during the process of the negotiations. And of course, you will have your confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements before you even release information, particularly sensitive information, to the other party. Because many prospective investors have complained that in Trinidad and Tobago that they have handed over their very sensitive information to institutions and to other persons, and then the deal does not go through, but afterward they realize that whatever information they handed over was used by the other party. Right? So you have to be very careful. Always make sure you get proper legal advice on matters like these, right? You do your due diligence, and I'll get into a little more detail, because here we're just dealing with the highlights of the prospective partner. And the due diligence in today's world ought to be very extensive. As I mentioned earlier, it's not only on the person's businesses or immediate business, but also all the subsidiaries and all the other persons he's connected with. You have to make sure that you get as much information as possible to save you grief in the long run. And of course, you would negotiate a joint venture agreement. You'll register the business. You secure licenses for the business. And then you operationalize the business by getting your staff, equipment, etc. Now, I know in one particular Caribbean country, we have particularly for professional services, you must have a license. In fact, the government of that country engaged my services to do a piece of work for them. And when I got there, they asked me, do you have a trade license? After I get there, do I have a trade license? I said, but you hired me. Who gives the trade license? They give the trade license. Right? In that particular country, what happens very often in these joint venture arrangements is that the license is applied for by the local person, right? And not the business. And the person who is coming in will be bringing in all the capital, all the skills, etc. And very often, the local person is a public servant. He has nothing to contribute to the business except the license. Right? He contributes the license. You bring in all the capital. I see you smiling like you have experience with that. You have experience with that? Good. Yeah. You bring in the capital and everything, right? And then the arrangement is structured not as a commercial joint venture or commercial business, but they would apply for a work permit for the joint venture partner. You're putting in everything into this business, you know. All he's doing is facilitating, right? He applies for a work permit for you. You get there, you work. Of course, you get no salary, you get no wages, you get nothing. And at the end of 2 weeks, the relationship goes sour. And this guy would present himself, the foreign joint venture partner, would present himself to the Ministry of Labor and say, hey, I have a work permit here. And for you to get a work permit, the work permit applicant, who is the employer, must provide a copy of your employment contract to the Ministry of Labor. So the Ministry of Labor has your employment contract. But you can now go to the Ministry of Labor and say, hey, I've been working for this guy for 18 months and I never get any salary because it was not an employment relationship. I have not got any leave. He has now dismissed me, and I want to get salary and I want to get leave according to the contract of employment that he submitted to the Department of Labor when he applied for the work permit. Well, strictly speaking, that is not an employment relationship. That's a commercial relationship that went sour. And he cannot enforce employment rights in these circumstances. So you've got to be very careful when you're dealing with, I wouldn't want to call the name of the country, but whenever anybody comes to you and tell you they want to get into a joint venture with you, but they have to apply for the license. And I'll have to bring you in as an employee. Be very, very careful. Very careful. Structure, the joint venture could either be a limited liability company, a partnership, or an unincorporated body. I think as business people, we know the the importance of having a limited liability company rather than a partnership. Your exposure to liability is restricted, and a limited liability company is limited to your your contribution to the share capital in the business. If you get into a partnership with someone and the person is a bit dodgy, your exposure could be very, very great. Right? Companies may retain their individual businesses or merge operations for a specific objective. Right? So you could retain your company operations, but you get into a joint venture only for one specific objective. Right? Always bear that in mind, because sometimes your partner may want you to merge your entire business into their business. Right? So always be aware of that. And people could collaborate for specific projects, particularly for tenders, submitting tenders. Right? You do not get into any formal joint venture arrangements, maybe a collaboration agreement or something like that, because your company on its own cannot provide all the services required by the tender. Right? Basic legal documentation that would be required, and we'll get into a little more details about this. The MOU, or your letter of intent. That's your intention that you want to negotiate this joint venture with this partner. What framework we would use for the negotiations, and of course that will be accompanied by your confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. With respect to sensitive information, sensitive business information, or confidential information that you may have to pass on to the other party. Right? You'd want to make sure that you are protected. Of course, the joint venture agreement, and in some cases you have shareholders agreement rather than the joint venture agreement. Basically, the structure and content would be almost similar. Your incorporation documents. If it's a new company, you would need to have the company incorporated. Your bylaws or your articles of association. License agreement for the use of technology. Where there's technology, please ensure that there's a license for the use of the technology. You may get yourself, just last week, earlier this week, I saw in the news where a company in Jamaica was manufacturing Clarks shoes for 2 years without any license from Clarks. So if somebody approach you in Trinidad here, because they know Trinidadians have money and they don't know what to do with their money, we open a Clarks company in Jamaica. We want you to invest some money in it. Please ensure that they have a license from Clarks before you put any money, or before you have any conversation with the person, any further conversation with the person. And of course, your trade licenses, because in some countries you need a trade license to operate. Right? Assessing your partner, make sure you have all his recent financial and business. You're aware of all his recent financial and business performances, right? So you might tell yourself, wow, within the last year, this company has made tremendous profit. But it may just be a book transaction caused by a change in the accounting method. Your business strategic framework, your management team. No, try to get information on the other party's management team as well. As much information as possible on their management team. You don't want a management team that, like what I'm reading about in the papers here about a certain regional institution based in Trinidad. Right? Which shall remain nameless. But where your senior managers are leaving or and claiming constructive dismissal on a regular basis. Right? The market reputation of this particular company, you need information on that. What's his market reputation? In terms of his products, in terms of his suppliers, what are the suppliers saying about this particular company? What are customers of the company saying of the particular company, right? You need to ensure that you get as much information as possible concerning the market reputation of your partner. Shared interest. What shared interest do you have with this particular company? Right? The trustworthiness of the particular company. Right? You'd want to make sure that as Larry said, it's like a marriage, right? Partnership is like a marriage, right? You have to share values, you have to be committed, and you have to be able to trust the partner. However, unlike a marriage, there's no courtship period. No courtship period, right? So make sure that the person is a trustworthy partner. His creditworthiness, please check on creditworthiness, because you wouldn't want to get into a relationship with somebody who does not have a good creditworthiness. And there are organizations that check creditworthiness of businesses.
Clive, would you say that in some of these arrangements, especially those that don't work out well, that perhaps companies place too much emphasis on that shared interest element?
Yeah.
And less on these some of the background elements which really make the success of the venture?
Yeah. A lot of times businesses just want to get off the ground, huh? They just want to get off the ground, want to go to the market as quickly as possible, right? Without doing the necessary checks, right? Whether your partner has matters in court or arbitration, or whether they are anticipated disputes, whether people have made claims in writing or sent pre-action protocol letters to the person. You need to find out about that, right? And of course, the labor relations history of the company. Right? You want to ensure that the person has good industrial relations practices, particularly where your partner might have a greater responsibility for employment matters. I wonder if we should go to due diligence. Yeah, okay, we'll go to due diligence now, right? It's very important to ensure that you get copies of the articles of incorporation of the partner, right? Articles of incorporation would indicate what restrictions, if any, on the business, etc., right? And his other corporate document, his bylaws, to see what are the powers and authority of his directors, etc. Minutes of directors meeting and shareholders meeting, that is very, very important. See if you can get your hands on the minutes of directors and shareholders meeting. It'll give you a little more background into the companies. Annual returns to see whether the company is in good standing. Trade licenses, whether they have trade licenses, whether they have their trademarks registered, whether if they have any patents, whether the patents are registered. If they don't have patents, what licenses or assignments they have. Make sure you get copies of that. Copies of distribution agreements. List of subsidiaries. This is very, very important when you're looking at the reach of the extra jurisdictional reach of the U.S. authorities. You need to find out what subsidiaries they have. Equity and debt financing agreements that they may have with the companies, because these agreements may affect the competence of the partner to enter into the arrangement with you. Mm-hmm. Or to enter into the arrangement without the consent of maybe the bank or whosoever has granted the financing. Stock options of the company, shareholder information, leases and other material contracts, insurance, and labor agreements. This could be made available to everyone here, so.
Yeah, in fact, it's going to be on Export TT's
on Export TT,
website.
yeah, so you need not, yeah. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, as we go along, Yeah. Then you do a due diligence on the litigation and the audits of the company, right? Or not only the audit reports you'd want to see, but even more important than the audit reports would be what is called management letters from the auditors, the letters to management concerning the internal accounting controls. So you're interested in the audits, yes, but you also want to see the auditors' management letters to the company, right? Because a lot of issues that are flagged in those management letters may not be reflected in the audit. Description of any recent change in the accounting method, and we spoke about that a little earlier. You'd want to know that from the partner, whether there has been any change in the accounting method used by the company. Active litigation involving letters, certain claims and complaints against your partners. Court judgments, not only court judgments you'd be interested in, but also orders of government agencies and what settlements have arrived at. Orders of government agencies, for example, like the OSHA department, the environmental agencies, etc., all the regulatory agencies, right? Health, the drug pharmaceutical one, which is it?
Chemistry, food, and drug.
Chemistry and food and drug, all the different agencies, right? You will need. Yeah, whether they comply with the regulations. And not only comply with the regulations, but also whether there were any complaints and any awards granted against the company. Right? For example, with Petrotrin and the oil spills, etc. Right? If you're from China negotiating with Petrotrin, you may not know about these oil spills unless you ask about orders of government agencies, orders of the EMA, etc.
Persons might be wondering where they get this information. And there are obviously a number of sources, but one source that perhaps companies often overlook are our embassies and our offices located in these areas. You may think that it's a lot of cocktail partying and whatnot, but the fact is that they are there and they are able to access some of this background information for you, perhaps easier than you can.
Yeah, Larry and I have a background in foreign relations, in the diplomatic service. And what we observe is that many businesses from Trinidad come up there and do business, and they do not contact the High Commission or the embassy at all. Those who contact the High Commission or the embassy are those that want to do business, but they don't have the competence or the capability, or they don't succeed in doing business. These are the ones that we tend to see approaching the embassies. And it's only when those who are doing business have problems, then they would approach the embassy.
How agile is the embassy in taking information from the I mean, that might be a reason why
Well, we left in 1998, and when we were there, I can't speak about what happens now, but when we were there, we were, very, very, if I may say, I'm a humble person, but if I may say, we were very diligent and efficient. Yeah. And most of our colleagues then.
Yeah.
But I do not know what happens now.
They have a natural advantage to start the official entry, the official point of entry.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with markets with, with different legal systems, different
language. Yeah, different culture. Yeah.
In my experience, Trinidad embassies in countries have not been
Really?
Uh-huh.
So, like, for instance, we targeted Colombia, and we have an office there, Trinidad has an office there.
No, we don't have one in Colombia.
We have one in Venezuela.
Venezuela, yeah.
Yeah.
We were targeting both Venezuela and Colombia. Office in Venezuela.
Was that
No response.
was that recently?
One phone call to the Colombian embassy and Barrage of Indonesia. And it was very helpful and guided us down the right path. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I find that the response is time. As you were saying,
Okay.
whether they have information or not, I can't answer because it just took so long that I didn't know what was that.
Okay.
Well, another source.